I'm Katharine Lusk. I'm the Executive Director of the BU Initiative on Cities, for those of you who don't know me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be moderating this next panel. So what's interesting is we're actually going to be talking about the human dimensions of sustainability. And it's interesting when you start to think about and even look at the presentations that the folks up here are going to go through, and you unpack what is a human dimension of sustainability, right? Well, there's humans involved who are researchers, who set a research agenda, who establish their priorities based on what's happening in the world, and set out to answer a certain set of questions. There are humans involved who are certainly research subjects, but also folks who either benefit from or suffer the consequences of the decisions that are made as it relates to sustainability. There are humans involved at governance levels. There are humans involved who are making decisions together, making decisions on behalf of others who they represent. And then, of course, there are so many faculty and students gathered here. There are humans involved who study these issues, who are students, who are learning how to answer research questions, how to establish research questions, and how to go out and actually help and serve some of these populations that we're concerned about. So any and all questions really related to any of those populations of humans are certainly relevant to this discussion. And I'm really interested to see how folks are going to touch on those in a wide variety of ways. So I'm going to actually go ahead and introduce all three panelists, and then I'll actually let them each go through their remarks rather than sort of getting up in the middle of everyone. And then I'll start off with a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the room. Great? So to start us off this afternoon is going to be Cutler Cleveland. Cutler is a professor of Earth and Environment in the College of Arts and Sciences here at BU. To his left is Henrik Selin. Henrik is an associate professor of international relations and director of curricular innovation at the Pardee School of Global Studies. And to Henrik's left is Anne Short, an assistant professor of Earth and Environment and a graduate faculty in the Department of Political Science here at BU. So first, please join me in welcoming Cutler.
Thank you, Katharine. It's really nice to be here. And again, thanks to Lucy and Tony for putting together a great event. As I was just remarking with Katharine, when I do events like this, I'm always amazed how I oftentimes know more about what my colleagues are doing in some other country than I am with colleagues that are literally across the street. And so it's probably says something about me, but it's really impressive to see what's happening here at BU. So I'm going to talk about energy. I know it's a big shock to those of you who know me, but in the context of sustainability. And it's not only going to be, when we think about energy, we typically think of energy sources, solar, wind, nuclear, and so on, but a huge part of the energy picture is on the human side, on the energy and use side. And I think, so that's the connection that I'll try and make. So this morning we heard about the three dimensions of sustainability or sustainable development, the economic and the social and environmental dimensions. And I would argue that energy is a central component of each of these components of human well-being. Energy is the motor of macroeconomic growth. The generation of GDP, if you look across nations, is highly correlated with the quantity of energy that countries use. And this is certainly not lost on places like China, for example, and other countries trying to improve standards of living in countries where one of the principal economic goals is to build more energy capacity, to supply more energy to produce GDP. Similarly, changes in the price of energy have dramatic effects on human well-being. Higher energy prices are contractionary at a macroeconomic perspective. They're connected with recessions, unemployment, inflation, higher interest rates, and so on. In the environmental dimension, as you all know, energy systems from cradle to grave are a major component of environmental change at local, regional, and global scales. Locally, with land use change, impacts on ecosystems and water quality. Regionally, think acid deposition, and globally, obviously, the whole climate change, the climate change connection. On the social side, energy is vital for the provision of basic social needs. And many people, a billion people in the world lack access to electricity. And you just contemplate that, a billion people lack of access to electricity. And so access to modern energy fuels often is pitched as a technological or economic issue, but fundamentally to many people in the world, it's an issue of equity and social justice. So energy is intimately connected with issues of poverty and inequity. So that's the connection between energy and sustainability. But what then is, if we flip the word sustainable from being a noun to an adjective, what is sustainable energy? In my definition, and you can find lots of definitions, happens to be that sustainable energy are patterns of production and use that support present and future well-being with the smallest life cycle economic, environmental, and social costs. So two key components there. One is it supports present and future well-being, which is not just per capita GDP, because human well-being and human happiness is connected to other aspects of life, connection to others, adequate leisure time, meaningful work beyond a paycheck that is only loosely connected with GDP. And as John Levy mentioned and emphasized this morning, we need to think about the entire life cycle of the energy system, from extraction, production, processing, use, and emissions. So the current energy system is unsustainable, and we heard many indicators of that in this morning's talk. But on the economic dimension, there are massive distortions of the market due to subsidies and externalities. According to the International Energy Agency, there were about $600 billion of subsidies given to energy industries in the world, $500 billion of which went to fossil fuels last year, which perversely tips the playing field in an economic sense towards fossil fuels. And externalities are similarly massive. The cost of climate change, the cost of air pollution, premature death, and so on are not included in the price we pay for energy, which again sends very perverse signals to consume more and to consume more of the fuels that harm the planet the most and kill the most people. On the environmental front, as I've already mentioned, I think it's pretty clear certainly to most of us in this room that from an environmental perspective, our current energy system is unsustainable because it literally unravels the natural capital fabric of the planet that supports all life, including human life. And in the social side, as I mentioned, the lack of access to modern energy is a huge issue. 1 billion people without electricity. 2.9 billion of the people in the world today burn wood, dung, or charcoal for fuel. 3 billion people. And not only does that diminish their capacity to achieve meaningful work, but also exposes them tremendous health impacts, particularly women, children, and the elderly. 4.3 million people in the world die prematurely due to the inhalation of air pollution associated with the burning of those fuels. So this is a massive human health issue as well. So for all these reasons, not just the environmental reasons, we need to shift. We need a transition of the world's energy system. So one of the projects that I've been interested in is looking at historic energy transitions. And I've done so over the years and currently with some colleagues in Europe who have looked at long-run energy transitions. And here in the US, I've done it with the help of Pete O'Connor, who was a recent PhD student in our department who's now working at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And Pete developed a database of energy use in the US back to the colonial period. And you might say, well, why do we want to look at history when what we're worried about is the future? But in a very simple way, history is the only observational space that we have to look at what causes major energy transitions to happen and what are their economic, social, environmental, and technological drivers and implications. And so with this set of colleagues in Europe, we've looked at long-run energy transitions with a view towards informing what can we do now, what should we do now, and how is now different than in the past. So I'm going to just talk about two takeaways from this work that I think are important. One is that major energy transitions almost always take a really, really long time. Not years or decades, but on the order of half and full centuries. So if you look at Sweden and the UK and Germany, and the United States and the former Soviet Union, and you look at shifts from wood to coal to oil to gas to electricity, these things unfold over very long periods of time for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is due to the massive investments that are needed in the technological infrastructure and the long lifetimes that those infrastructures have. Here's one example of this. The vertical axis here shows what percent of our electricity generation in the US comes from various sources back to 1920. And a couple of points to make on this. The one that always strikes me is to look at coal, which is at the bottom there. So in 1920, coal was generating about half our electricity. As recently as 6 years ago, coal was still generating half our electricity. So that's an amazing inertia of our baseload generation. Wars, recessions, energy price shocks, all the things, changes in affluence, complete restructuring of the economy away from manufacturing towards services, and yet coal has remained the baseload of power generation. Notice, however, that started to change pretty quickly at the end. You can see the rise, for example, of natural gas there in green, which has grown to rapidly replace coal, due in part to its abundance and low cost, but also due to some of its environmental advantages. You can also see the effect of policy. The maroon there, the purple is oil, and you can see that in the 1970s, with the oil price shocks, U.S. federal policy explicitly forbid or actively discouraged the use of oil to generate electricity, and it went away fairly quickly from generating electricity. So these transitions play out over very long periods of time. So notice, we think about low carbon sources of energy. Where are they? Well, we have hydro, which is in there and still is important. It's been there for a long time. We have some capacity, but relatively limited capacity to expand hydro. We have nuclear power, which is a powder keg in terms of its desirability. We think of wind and solar and all the attention that's been paid to them, but look at, in terms of the long run, look at wind, which is the red up in the corner. And so it's expanded tremendously. Most of the new power generation last year and this year in the country will be wind and solar, but it's still a pretty small chunk of the total. In solar, you can barely see it. At the very, very top, black. Like the width of the border of the graph almost overstates the importance of solar in wind generation capacity. Now, it's the fastest growing along with wind, but as a total share, and what's important here is not just, is the total amount of carbon we abate with solar and wind. So this penetration needs to be speeded. And it needs to go faster than what's happened in the past, in some type of business as usual scenario. So notice what I said, big energy transitions almost always take a long time. And Denmark has shown us what you can really do if you want to get serious in a major way. And the Danes have decided that they were going to decarbonize their electricity generation, and they were going to build a lot of wind turbines to do it. And if you look at this graph, which shows the percentage of Danish electricity coming from wind, you can see that just in a span of the last 4 years, it's doubled from 20 to 40%. And they have made a commitment to essentially generate almost all their electricity in a pretty quick time period from wind energy. And I'm sure they'll do it. So this is an example of how things can happen really quickly on a major scale. And so the issue here is, how did this happen? Well, one is policy, right? So the Danish government, through feed-in tariffs, liberalization, all kinds of financial incentives, subsidies to wind energy, sped that. But also technology, rapid cost declines in generation of wind energy, which is also happening for solar. And most important, not most importantly, but equally as important, the social dimension. The Danes buying into the fact that this is something that was important for the country to do, and the country as a whole, largely, is behind it. And so they're willing to pay higher prices to pay these subsidies for electricity to affect this transformation. So here's one example of how things can go faster than they have in the past. The other major takeaway is having to do with which part of the supply chain we focus on. Again, historically, when we thought of energy transitions, we think of changes in sources: wood, coal, oil, and wind energy or electricity. But energy end use really drives energy transitions. The two are tightly coupled, obviously, but changes in energy end use have really driven a lot of the changes in the sources that we've used. So, for example, advances in steam power, the steam engine, to drive locomotives, and as stationary power in industry, really drove the demand for coal. In fact, the steam engine really was commercialized to pump water out of deep coal mines. The internal combustion engine and the petrochemical industry really increased and drove the demand for oil. And electrification across all sectors of the economy created the need for electric utilities. So in each of these cases, changes in energy and use, how people and industries use energy, is really what drove the development of the sources themselves. It wasn't necessarily, oh, we discovered oil, now how can we use it? We discovered early on that we could use oil as a better light source than tallow or animal fat, and that's how the oil industry got started, kerosene for lighting. Here's one example of the importance of energy and use driving transitions. This is some work by Roger Fouquet and Peter Pearson in the UK, where they developed this really long time series of energy use going back many centuries. So in blue is the price of energy for lighting. So it's the real price of energy for tallow, the animal fat they use to make candles, then the cost of energy for kerosene and manufactured gas, and then the cost of electricity for light bulbs. And you can see that it kind of declines slowly and then drops quickly at the end. The yellow line is the actual cost, the price of the service to people to purchase lighting. So the cost per kilowatt hour, you want to think in this case, it's per lumen hour, which is the amount of actual visible light. And you can see that the price to consumers of purchasing the service, not the energy, dropped way faster due to technological improvements. Right? We heard about those this morning from our colleague in engineering, about the tremendous improvements in the efficiency of lighting, which made it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to purchase, to use lighting. So why is this important? Well, the efficiency improvements, whether it's of cars or lights or refrigerators, has tremendous economic and environmental benefits. Because if you lose less energy, consumers pay less for it, and you reduce the emissions and environmental damage associated with using the energy source. So focusing on the demand side is equally as important as the supply side. So in closing, what are a couple of implications of this? One is that in terms of a historical perspective, a business as usual perspective is not acceptable. We cannot wait many, many decades or half a century for the technological and economic and geopolitical forces to eventually extract all the carbon and bake us all, and then we'll make the transition to solar and wind. This needs to be a managed transition, and this raises lots of political issues on the role of the market versus the role of government in making decisions about how investments are made. And this will be a pivotal battle on needing to speed this transition. How do we generate the investment to do it? And also that policy and investment should not just be focusing on building a better wind turbine or more efficient solar cell, but the importance of investing in more efficient buildings, cars, laptops, phones, and so on, and how people use energy in their homes and business and industries needs to be supported through research, education, and so on, as well as the supply side. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Queued up, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So just-
Oh, go on. There was one extra.
Oh, there we go. All right. All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to Lucy and Tony for inviting me to come here and talk to you about my research on sustainability. I'm working in a couple of different areas, including climate change and regional governance and European Union and so forth. But what I want to talk to you today is the research that I've been doing and continue doing when it comes to hazardous substances and how managing hazardous substances better is an absolutely critical sustainability issue and some of the research that I and others have been doing in that particular area. So when I talk about hazardous substances, I mean both naturally occurring elements, mostly then heavy metals, like mercury or cadmium or lead, for instance. There's a lot of discussions around lead now. But also commercially produced compounds, a wide range of industrial chemical and pesticides and so forth. Now, our use of these substances have given and continue to give us enormous benefits. Our modern society is entirely dependent on us continuing using heavy metals and chemicals in numerous ways. But what we also know is that there are a number of very serious environmental and human health risks associated with the use of at least some of these substances. So the billion-dollar or trillion-dollar question here is, how can we sort of use these substances in a safe way so we reap all the benefits of modern life while trying to reduce, if not eliminate, the environmental and health problems associated with this? And there are a couple of things that make this tricky. This is both about local uses, but also about long-range transport. Many of these substances travel across national borders, sometimes even on a global scale. Many of them are persistent. They have a long half-life, either in soil or water or air. That is, once we release them into the environment, they tend to stay there for a long time. A long time can be days, weeks, months, decades, or even centuries, depending on what we're talking about. Many of them are toxic already at small doses, and then they bioaccumulate and biomagnify up the food webs. So those that are at the top of food webs tend to be the ones that have the highest burden of these, body burden, because the main exposure for us humans and animals tend to be through dietary intake. And if you ponder it, humans are, of course, often at the top of their food webs, which means that we are then among the ones that are most exposed. And since I'm working in the Pardee School, I'm interested in international collaboration. And in order to address these substances, you're going to have extensive international collaboration because there are a number of transboundary dimensions here: environmental in terms of transport, technical in terms of abatement technology, diffusion of green technology, economic in the sense that there is an extensive trade both in these substances and in goods containing them, and political and legal dimension of this as well. So I study public international law, which is law by states for states. There are currently 193 UN member states, which means that if we bring together a big meeting to talk about persistent organic pollutants or mercury or climate change, we are sending in an invitation to over 193 countries, and then we need to come up with a solution that is acceptable to 193 countries. Right? And in this area, we have then developed a number of separate treaties that look at these heavy metals and persistent organic pollutants. But there are also a number of other programs. A lot of research in my field is related to public-private partnership, initiatives within the private sector, and so forth. But what it basically comes down to is trying to develop policy and appropriate management strategy in the face of very diverging backgrounds and interests, both within countries, but very much also across countries. With the rise of China and the BRICS and everything else that my colleague, Professor Gallagher, likes to talk about, we are definitely seeing a new world order, and that changes also dynamics in international environmental cooperation also on hazardous substances. So what I've been studying, this was a book that came out a couple of years ago, is looking at negotiation strategies that actors have in the international system, drivers of developing more coherent policy. A lot of that has to do with North-South dimension, industrialized and developing countries, but also the role of Arctic issues in this. and also sort of studying how initiatives across forum are linked and impact outcomes. These can both be positive and negative. Sometimes you reach political agreement under one treaty. For instance, under the Basel Convention, we figured out an approach for dealing with mercury waste. When you then develop a mercury agreement, then you have that as a baseline. You can build on that. It's easier to develop policy. But you can also have negative consequences. One of the perennial fights under many of these agreements has to do with funding mechanism. How should they be? What's an appropriate level? How should we deal with capacity building, common but differentiated responsibility, and all of that stuff? And sometimes you then have disagreement in one forum that spills over in another, because country knows that if you compromise in Forum A or Forum B, Forum A, then that will impact your interest in Forum B. So if you capitulate in one area, that can spill over in others, and therefore in many ways they are more reluctant to compromise. So one thing that I've also been interested in and studying is this notion of a global multi-level governance. One thing that we are very well aware of is that there are lots of global things that goes on, whether that is the Paris Agreement or any of the agreement on climate change. And then we need to have local action, and sometimes that is a very, very, very large gap. And one of the sort of policy solutions that they have experimented with in the area of hazardous substances, which they haven't really done anywhere else, is to create regional centers under these global treaties, which are then supposed to basically act as an intermediary. You have the global discussions, you basically channel them through regional center, and regional, I don't mean geographically, regional centers, and then they help countries implement the agreement. So some of my research have been looking into the effectiveness of this. In short, this seems like a good idea, but their implementation is actually not particularly well done. So far, these regional centers are more existing on paper than they have real-world impact. But that is something that could change, and that's where we need more policy-relevant research. More recently, in the broader area of hazardous substances, I've moved away more from hazardous chemicals, moved away from the DDTs and the PCBs of the world, and focusing mostly on mercury and heavy metals. And the reason for that is fairly practical. In 2013, we got the Minamata Convention on mercury. We had talked about more or less a decade, should we have a mercury agreement or not. Once we decided that that was a good idea, it took another 3 to 4 years to negotiate it, so it took us about 15 years to get there, but we're there. And the basic goal of this convention is to protect human health and the environment from anthropogenic emissions and releases of mercury. The negotiators figured out that they can't really control natural emissions. As the delegate from New Zealand pointed out, it was not in his authority to decide whether a volcano would erupt or not. So therefore, we are largely focusing on the anthropogenic side. And the good news here with the Minamata Convention is that we have now sort of a comprehensive life cycle focus on the production, use, trade, and emissions and releases on mercury. And to connect what Cutler said, one of the largest sources of mercury emission is coal-fired power plants. So there is a very, very strong dimension to energy and sustainability here. We are now moving ahead, so my research has then focused, sort of shifted from negotiating agreements to implementing agreements. So right now, a large number of countries have signed on. We're up to 25 parties. We're going to need 50 parties for the agreement to enter into force. That will probably happen fairly soon. The European Union is gearing up to get its implementation legislation in place, and if you then have that, suddenly you have 21 countries that are ready to move ahead, which would put you over to 50. One thing that is worth noting here is that the United States of America was actually the very, very first party to this convention, which if you look at other global environmental areas over the last 25 years, the United States have largely been the last one, or they have stayed out altogether. But this is actually an area where the United States, together with a couple of others, have shown real leadership. And I said that we talked about a decade whether we should have a negotiation or not. And the single most important thing that sort of pushed them over the edge was when the United States, during the first year of the Obama administration, came out in support of negotiating an agreement, and then also helped to push other countries, including India and China, that had been skeptical, to sort of move it along. So it's also an interesting case that shows that the United States can still be very influential if it actually is willing to do that. So I'm then continuing, as I said, working on Mercury. So the Minamata Convention draws attention to Mercury issues and problems. It creates a legal and political platform, but many of the initial mandates are weak. If we are to meet the objective of the convention of protecting environment and human health, we need to strengthen standards. There's absolutely no way around it. And also, for the last couple of minutes, try to talk a little bit about where I see my research moving on Mercury specifically. And one of the things I think here is that Mercury it's a very important environmental and human health issues in its own right, but I think it's also an extremely interesting case of a sustainability transition. So the idea here is to try and sketch out basically a systems-oriented conceptual framework for analyzing human and natural activities. This means drawing from an existing literature that is out there, literature on sustainability science, coupled natural and human systems, engineering systems, and governance to sort of help sketch out the core perspectives and arguments of this conceptual framework, and then apply it in a much more coherent way to mercury pollution and management that has been done in the past. There is a lot of separate natural science research. There's a lot of, not a lot, but there's some growing social science research in this, but they haven't really been integrated. And the idea here is to sort of collaborate with other people and to do this in a four-step analytical approach. And again, we are very much at the beginning of this. This may or may not change. My guess is it will change, but it's sort of just to give you an idea of where our thinking is and where we're heading. So the first is to sort of draw from sustainability science and coupled natural human systems literature and map the main natural and social components of the Mercury system. To look at both temporal and spatial scale of the Mercury system, try to figure out what it basically looks like, and then it also involves taking a historical perspective on Mercury use and pollution over both time and space. Once we have done that, the second step is then to model central dynamics within the Mercury system, right? So how is Mercury in this coupled human and natural system interacting, and how has it changed through time and space? And here, just for efficiency, we then have to do sort of illustrative examples of how Mercury moves in both natural and social systems, and again, how that changed over time. Once we have that down, is to then study illustrative responses within the Mercury system, right? So look at sort of separate discrete cases of how different coupled systems have been dealing with Mercury issues, with Mercury pollution, how they have responded or not responded, the effectiveness of these responses. And the idea is then to work with examples from different geographical parts of the world. The Arctic might be a good one, the Great Lakes might be a good one, Minamata Bay in Japan, the place for where the convention is named for might be other, artisanal small-scale gold mining in developing countries and ports. And then, because we're very much interested in policy-relevant research, is then, once we have done that and have a better understanding of it, examining prospects for better Mercury management. And this is then where the notion of sustainability goals, sustainability transitions comes in. So, as we know, we have taken some step to mitigate the Mercury problem, but we still have a long way to go to get it under control. And what opportunities are there then for designing better responses for promote sustainable development, and then hopefully insights and lessons from the Mercury case can then translate also outside the Mercury case and talk to or speak to the broader literature on sustainability transition. And very last thing, I'm also involved in organizing the 13th International Conference on Mercury as a Global Pollutant. It's a global conference. It's happening every 2 years. Next time is in 2017. It will be here in Rhode Island, in New England, next door in Rhode Island, in Providence. So anyone that has any interest in hazardous substances in general and mercury in particular, this is going to be a very nice, I hope, interdisciplinary conference. Thank you very much.
I want to just start by thanking Lucy and Tony again, and all of you for joining us on this beautiful afternoon, on this very first day of spring that is happening in the spring. I'm going to start by talking about a class that I teach on sustainable development. And in that class, we explore the many and conflicting definitions of sustainability and the many and conflicting definitions of development. We explore how useful synergies and alliances are created by the vagueness of these definitions, as well as how that same vagueness is able to allow business as usual to masquerade as radical progress. We examine how different values and interests lead to different notions of sustainability, and we examine how these different values and interests also lead to different ideas about appropriate and desirable pathways for policy and other forms of actions that are taken in the name of sustainability. We look briefly, but we do look at who gets to make decisions about sustainability and who gets left behind from those decisions. So who is not at the table? In class, I draw attention to the distributional consequences of decisions that are made in the name of sustainability, and we examine how policies and projects have benefits for some and impose costs on others. How policies and projects direct attention to certain issues and away from other issues. And in the end, I encourage students to directly address the subjectivity of sustainability in their classes, in their research, in their lives, and in the work that they plan to do in the future, be it explicitly focused on sustainability or not. And so many of the themes that I just outlined also influence my own research. As I talk about my research and what I do, I'm going to break one of the common rules of scientific presentations, and I'm going to talk about my feelings and my interests. This guideline to never do this has two roots. The first is that doing this often leads you down a bad pathway, where it is difficult to integrate this into a successful technical talk, and so I'm just going to hope that I don't go there. The second is because there's a concern about undermining objectivity. And this is exactly why I want to do it. I want to be clear that my research efforts, and indeed most research efforts on sustainability, and even more indeed, most research efforts, stem from our subjective interests. This does not mean that our research is not valuable. It does not mean that our research is full of bias. But it's important to recognize the way that research drives our work. So I'm an interdisciplinary social scientist, and my work is motivated by my own love of the natural environment, by my belief in the value of multiple forms of knowledge and the multiple ways of creating knowledge, and my commitment to issues of justice. And so the broad aim of my work is that I want to reduce the degradation of the environment while being attentive to the social and distributive consequences that these efforts to promote environmental protection have. And so because of this, I focus my work on the human side of environment and conservation challenges, and I address a series of questions that are related to the governance and management of changing social and ecological systems. So in the rest of the time that I have today, I'm going to talk about some of the broad questions and approaches that I take, and then I'm going to talk about a project that's a little bit of an outlier in my research portfolio, work that examines the challenges and implications of governing the environmental effects of cannabis cultivation or marijuana production. So starting broadly, as I mentioned, all of my work talks about the governance and management of changing social and ecological systems. So some of the topics I've addressed include research that looks at the social and ecological drivers and consequences of urban and rural development, work that looks at the politics and possibilities of changing paradigms of flood management, and how changing ideas and movement from flood defense, where we build levees and use dams to stop the risk of floods, to instead thinking about using land and integrated flood management to reduce the likelihood that floods reach downstream users, how this redistributes the risk of floods and influences policy acceptance and the politics surrounding flood management. I'm starting a project that looks at changing deer management in suburban Massachusetts in areas where social and ecological effects of high deer densities are prompting communities to reintroduce one of the primary predators of deer in the area, hunters. And in each of these projects, there's an element of change. And this social or ecological change that draws me to these issues is also one that's associated with social or ecological problems, which is why we want to do something about them. And so to address these problems, or any problem, we need to understand and characterize them. So this is the part of sustainability that includes measuring and modeling both the social and ecological drivers and consequences of these systems. But then we, as individuals or groups, need to manage and govern these systems. We need to come together to make decisions and to change behavior to address these challenges. And this is hard. In the first panel this morning, some of the engineers, their talks suggested that it is more promising to make a smart building than it is to make smarter people when it comes to lighting and climate. And so when we think about this, these are big challenges. It's easiest to think about governance for simple or stable problems that have little uncertainty, and it's most difficult in circumstances where problems or systems are changing, where we're encountering new challenges, and in problems and systems where there are different values and norms. And so many, or perhaps most of the challenges that come to mind when we think about sustainability exhibit these characteristics that make it so hard to govern them. And so throughout my work, I take an explicitly normative approach where my goal is to produce better governance of environmental problems. And so to do so, I think about how and why current approaches work in a particular way. And the aim is to think about how we can make these work better, while also acknowledging, though, that this idea of better depends on who's defining it. So I'm going to switch gears a bit, and I'm going to talk specifically about a project that looks at how we're governing the environmental effects of cannabis cultivation in the north coast of California. This is not an issue I set out to study, and indeed, if there was a yearbook superlative for least likely to know how cannabis is grown, I would have been a top contender. But in the course of my dissertation research, it became an issue that I could not ignore. So some context for this. California is the largest domestic producer of cannabis. It's estimated to grow between 60 and 80% of the cannabis that is consumed in the United States. The North Coastal Basin, which is comprised of Humboldt and Mendocino counties and is located in the northwest of the state, is one of the highest producing regions. It's ideal for cannabis production from a social and an ecological perspective. It's remote, it's forested, it has a climate conducive to cannabis production, it's sparsely populated, and it has a land zoning system that makes it relatively easy to have land that is taxed at a low value available for cultivating cannabis. Cannabis production in the region is traced back to the late 1960s, when there was a movement of back to the landers, or populations of countercultural urban migrants who moved mostly from San Francisco up to the northwest of California to these rural areas to start intentional communities. And they initiated, as part of this, small-scale cultivation of cannabis on private lands. Since then, though, the scale and location of cultivation has shifted, the actors involved, and the range of practices have diversified. The industry has grown tremendously, particularly in the past decade. An assessment of production sites across 4 watersheds, just looking at what you can see and identify using aerial photography, has shown that from 2005 to 2012, there's been an increase of more than 50 to 100% just between 2005 and 2012 in many of these areas. The growth of the industry and changes in cultivation practices can be linked to changing social, cultural, and economic circumstances that have increased a need for economic activity in these rural areas, which has also increased acceptance of production of an illegal substance among a more diverse set of residents. It's also been facilitated in various ways by changing international, federal, and state drug laws and law enforcement regimes. Of import for my work especially has been Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, which legalized marijuana for medical uses in California in 1996. It was the first state to legalize medical marijuana. So cultivation of marijuana in the north coast of California occurs in a gray area of legality. It is legal for medical purposes by state law. Cultivation is illegal for any other purpose by state law, and it's illegal regardless of the purpose by federal law. Begs the question of how it can be legal if it's illegal, but that's part of the conundrum. It is also, though, in this region, socially and culturally accepted. It's disputed, but it's largely socially and culturally accepted, so it's a licit production system. There's a limited threat of prosecution of cultivation activities in the region for various reasons, unless you are one of the largest producers on public lands. You are unlikely to face prosecution. And all of this feeds into a very significant mixing of the medical and black markets, which is really important when we think about how we are governing this system. The environmental effects of cultivation are believed to be substantial. The environmental concerns of cannabis cultivation are similar to the concerns associated with any crop, agricultural crop. Water use, nutrient pollution, pesticide application, erosion, habitat destruction, and energy use. But these are exacerbated because they're frequently illegal and unpermitted, and they often take place in close proximity to streams and sensitive habitat. We know that these are out there. We have some ideas about how big some of the impacts are, but they are very difficult to study, and I can talk at great length about that, but don't have time to talk about all of the challenges of studying something that is quasi-legal. There are additional concerns associated with production, particularly production on private lands, on public lands, which includes clear cutting, trash, poaching, and the spread of non-native species. When I started working in this region on my dissertation research in 2008, there was a broad awareness among agency staff and other actors about the likely environmental effects of cannabis cultivation in the region. But there was very little data. There were almost no resources to study or address the issue, and there was no legislative mandate to address the issue. In fact, among regulators, there was active avoidance of sites with cannabis present. So I did interviews with agency staff, and I asked them, what's going on with cannabis? Is this an issue for you? And they said, yes, this is a big issue for our environment. And I said, oh, so what do you do about it? And they said, oh, nothing. I said, well, why don't you do it? I said, well, there's no money, there's no funding, and it's a safety concern. So if we're out in the field and we see cannabis, we turn around and we don't report it. So in 2008, we were in a situation where people were very aware of an issue, but were completely unable to do anything about it. There have been several efforts since then to make cultivation more visible on the landscape, to bring these issues to the attention of state governments, and this has state government, and this has significantly changed the policy surrounding it, starting in 2015. So I was part of a team that wrote a policy-relevant review of the environmental effects of cannabis production in California that was published in mid-2015. And in that article, we argued that the environmental concerns had been missing from policy discussion and all the policy discussion about the liberalization of marijuana production. And that in California, this had contributed to some very damaging environmental practices. The team was led by 2 staff members from the Nature Conservancy, and following publication, they were able to use their significant policy and staff resources to work with state legislators to influence a bill that was coming out to take steps to address some of these environmental concerns. And significant changes happened. There is now a mandatory licensing system for commercial producers of medical marijuana. There's an explicit law that requires producers to comply with environmental regulations. There is a designated responsibility to an agency for developing guidelines for pesticide application, which is extremely complicated due to a federal prohibition on touching marijuana plants. And there are also in California now significant budget resources to manage these efforts and enforce environmental regulations. So this legislation addresses the medical marijuana market, and it provides some very promising tools to do so. But there are some serious challenges and questions that remain. So though we can't quantify it, we know there is significant mixing of the medical and black market. This legislation effectively creates a system that forces people to choose and that separates markets. This is arguably a good thing, But it also is very unclear how people are going to make that decision. It is unclear whether the profits that they view themselves as obtaining through the medical marijuana industry will be large enough to sign off and to say that we are no longer going to participate in the black market. It is unclear whether it will push people back under the shadows. Right now, if you look at aerial imagery, you can identify many marijuana production sites. This, though, reduces some of the cultural acceptance and the legal acceptance of production by creating a system where people are now tagged as either illegal or legal, and is likely, I think, to push people back under the trees, and I can explain that more later if people are interested. But it's also important to understand and think about how my work and this legislation focuses specifically on the environment. But this intersects with other dimensions of sustainability. The economic and social dimensions of cultivation are important for rural communities. There's a researcher who has looked at how rural communities are successfully surviving in California and what makes communities thrive or not. And what she has found is that when she looks at differences in communities, the ones that are thriving are ones that have very strong marijuana production industries. And as we think about this legislation that's going through, it's going to shift the economic status of the industry. It's going to shift who's benefiting from the industry in very important ways. And so I wanted to talk about this because this case highlights the power of research, data, and publications, the value of working with partners who have policy as a mission. It highlights the importance of thinking about unlikely and illegal issues, and it highlights the intersection of ecological, social, and economic concerns, and how they can intersect in some surprising ways, and also how a focus on one can ripple through and then redistribute benefits in others. Thanks.
I'll stand up because I realize this side of the room I'm blocked by the dais here. Thank you all. That was terrific. So I'm going to start. I think I'm probably going to pose 2 questions, and then if folks aren't at the mic and ready to jump in, then I'll go into additional questions. But so start thinking now. So I'm really interested in the fact that all 3 of you touched on. You're all academic researchers. Obviously, right? We're all here. But you all touched on your influence on policymakers and political actors in various ways. And I'm curious if I really want to talk a little bit about influence. You are people with a particular skill set trying to influence other people who are decision makers, sometimes operating with imperfect information and doing the best they can on behalf of others. And I would love you each to talk about some of the lessons you've learned along the way in how you choose to exert your influence as academic researchers. And I'm not going to go down the line. I'm actually going to start with Henrik, and then go to Anne, and then come back to Cutler, because I think you guys, Henrik and Anne, you spend sort of a lot more time in this space. It's sort of that intersection of the research and the policy. And then Cutler, I know, is delving into this territory this summer, at a minimum, delving into this territory this summer with the City of Boston. But I want to get a better understanding of how do you, as people, how do you use your knowledge base and your skill set to influence those decision makers and those political actors and policymakers?
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, there's a question. One of the things I have learned over the years is that method and style of communication is absolutely essential, that you need to figure out who your audience is and then try to target a way to reach that. And again, that's both in terms of the style and content of what you're trying to say. Now, one of the wonderful things we have here at BU is the Pardee Center. And I had a slide there where I had a sort of an issue in brief that I had did with respect to implementing the Minamata convention. And it sort of tried to do a combination of both more old-fashioned academic research, more academic books and articles and stuff, but also more policy-oriented reports, papers, and so forth, and getting it out there. And I definitely don't see it as my role to sort of make policy, not at all. I'm not a policymaker. But similar to Anne, I do want to see better environmental governance, and that is sort of trying to figure out what is working, what is not working. If it's not working, how can we potentially do it slightly different? And that's then sort of the policy-oriented communication that goes with that.
Anne?
Sure, I've been struggling how to structure my thoughts here, because I think that's a really important question, and I think that thinking about the method and style of communication, as Henrik just said, is extremely important. I also think thinking about the ways that we ask questions and the ways that we build partnerships are important. And so in this project that I'm now developing about deer management, which I'm developing in partnership with John Connors, who's over there in the room, one of the things that we've done early on is we had a meeting with the Department of Fish and Wildlife in Massachusetts. And we sat down and we listened to what they're doing, what their concerns are, and discovered that kind of a little feedback here, discovered that there are lots of questions that are academically interesting to me and John, and that are also extremely relevant to the agencies themselves. And so by co-developing our research questions, we can ensure that the findings that we have are can directly feed into their programs. I also want to talk about bravery, I guess, or courage, because I think that as academics, we know what we know, and then we also have an extreme familiarity with the limitations of our knowledge and all the ways that our knowledge can be used wrong. And I think that this is one of the biggest hurdles that we need to, as a community, figure out how we want to get over if we want to have an influence. And so we as a community are excellently practiced at finding what's wrong with the way that our current system works. And there's a lot of fear associated with suggesting ways to change that, because without a doubt, those changes are going to have problems associated with them. And we, as researchers and as scholars, know that. And so it takes a lot to put yourself out on a limb and to not just say, well, here's some findings of my studies that are policy relevant, but to take the next step and say, well, here's what some policy possibilities might be, when you know that those are going to also produce imperfect policies.
Great, thank you. Cutler?
Well, I was lucky that I had a few moments to jot a few ideas down. So a couple of ideas here, and more just bullet points. One is I'm a teacher, so I teach a lot of students who are going to go out there in the world and work on these issues. And I think that's by far and away the biggest impact that I've had, teaching students, the importance of science and the rigor of academic inquiry, but also that there's a connection with these issues to real life. And many of our graduates, and there's a few of them here today, are actually out there doing these exact things and affecting the types of change that we need to see. So I think that I'm actually prouder of that than all of my research that I've done. I've changed my publication mode away from peer-reviewed journal articles to including those but broader books and reference works that reach a broader audience who are thinking about these issues in and outside of academia. I've taken stands on, spoke out on issues not related to, that are more controversial. I've been involved in the fossil fuel divestment issue here on campus and across the country, which is, brings up a lot of different issues for universities and all their constituents. I've done a fair bit of consulting where policy related, so I've done a lot of work with the Energy Information Administration, which is the data gathering and modeling arm of the U.S. Department of Energy, where they decide what data to collect and what policy questions to answer. So I've tried to have some influence there. And I've also been involved over the years with a lot of direct political work. I did a lot of work over the years for John Kerry while he was senator. He was very active in U.S. energy independence issues, so I tried to get my 2 cents heard there. So anyways.
Great, thank you. That's illuminating set of examples. Second question, I guess, so Connor LeBlanc is right over here with the microphone for those who are getting ready. But second question for me, because we're still talking about the human dimension of sustainability, I mean, when we talk about sustainable energy, when we talk about hazardous substances, when we talk about some of the environmental degradation and environmental consequences of cannabis, there are other people involved, right? I mean, there are folks who are not necessarily the decision makers, who are not in influential roles as policymakers, who are farmers and growers, who are residents in those communities, right? Who are workers in factories, who are really sort of suffering some of the other consequences. People in their homes who are making certain decisions. And so my follow-up question is related to the ways in which those folks need to be or should be influenced, and whether or not that is part of your purview, or really whose job is it? So if we're thinking about the behavioral change that is sort of critical within each of your respective lines of work, who at the end of the day is responsible for changing the behavior for the folks on the front lines? Is it the policymakers? Is it the researchers? Is it some other set of educators? What have you all learned about that?
I'm happy to go first. So first I'll clarify that when I talk about governance, I'm not just talking about policy. Governance includes any set of activities that involves people coming together to organize to solve some sort of problem or issue. And so this involves government actors as well as NGOs, as well as individual citizens. And it includes regulations and then also non-regulatory formal activities, things like voluntary activities, education programs, technical assistance. And then it also includes informal ways that people come together. So this could be things like social norms or peer pressure that changes what people do and how they're influenced. And so the purview of my research extends beyond the policy arena into all of these other areas. And I think in terms of thinking about how you have influence beyond, or who should, and how you do have influence beyond policy, I certainly see the lessons from my work intersecting with nonprofit organizations and also individuals. I have in all of my work all focuses on land and land use, and so I have a very easy way forward for thinking about how you partner and influence individuals, which is land-grant institutions all have an arm of their university that's dedicated to extension activities, and extension activities are outreach activities. So there are a number of universities. UMass Amherst has an extension office. UC Berkeley has an extension office. And so I've partnered with people who work in these extension offices where their jobs are to do research, and then their mission is to translate the results of academic research into findings that can be used and are used by individual actors in who are focused on land-based activities, so forestry, production, agriculture, and increasingly other types of management of land as well. And so I have worked very closely with people in extension looking at issues in Northern California, and now I'm partnering with someone who's looking at marijuana issues in California from an extension perspective, and then also looking at conservation and land use issues in Massachusetts as well.
Yeah, I would just like to pick up on the NGO point that you made. You know, in the United States on climate change, you know, the real action is not happening at the national level. It's at a much more local grassroots level. Towns, cities who are really taking, pushing the envelope, and hopefully that bottom-up pressure will, force some change that needs to happen in Washington. But, the power of communities and individuals is very potent. We have a woman here, I'm sorry, I don't remember your first name, but she's joined us here she lives in West Roxbury, and her community is in the crosshairs of this natural gas pipeline that they want to build through New England. And one of those pipelines now appears to be on life support or killed, in part because of local opposition of people who got together, who didn't have access to any sort of fancy academic research, but who were concerned about the impacts that this energy project would have in their community, and they were an effective social and political force. And so I think that the role of civil society in this disaggregated, decentralized power is super important. Brookline too. I see my friend from Brookline Solar here as well.
Yeah, I would say that local community engagement is often absolutely critical, but it can also be extremely complex. So for many of the hazardous substances that I have studied, as I mentioned, the main way in which humans are exposed to them is through dietary intake, and especially through seafood. Some of the highest concentrations in people anywhere in the world has been in the Arctic, especially in indigenous communities. And that's almost entirely related to long-range transport of pollutants from other parts of the world, because they don't originate from within the Arctic, but they get to the Arctic. And then it's through their dietary choices. But these dietary choices is not just about eating so you can fill your belly. There are very important social, cultural, religious aspects to that. So as you're trying to figure out with researchers how exposed are these local communities, because you don't want to go in there and scare them, and there's a long history of people coming from the outside and doing really, really stupid things and then just leaving. So it's about building trust. It's about adequately and correctly communicate not just risk, but what can be done about it. And also then recognizing all the cultural aspects of the food system in remote places. And this is not something that one group can do. This requires local community leaders. It requires policymakers. It requires the involvement of researchers, local advocacy groups, and all of them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Tony, shut up.
Never mind.
Tony Janettos, ready.
So I've got a question really for the whole panel, and it sort of revolves around who gets the voice, who gets to play, who's at the table when decisions actually get made. I'm struck by an experience I had in the nearly a decade that I worked in the NGOs, where in the run-up to some climate convention or other, we were in the midst of having a very spirited discussion with the person in EPA who was responsible for climate policy. And the discussion quickly came to an end when he got irritated and said, "Who cares what you NGOs think? You don't have a seat at the table." And so how does this play out? Who gets a seat at the table in these kinds of issues? And what does that mean for the people who don't?
All right, I can start. So if we're talking about what I'm mostly focusing on, then the international negotiations, then each country is there represented by their national government. And in the case of most countries, most of the people that are sitting behind their country flag are working in different parts of the government, right? So in the US, that could be people from the US EPA, there could be people from the State Department, there could be air quality people, there could be DOE people, and so forth. In some delegations, they also do include people from academia and research institutions. It's not so common that the Americans do that, but other countries do that, for instance, that have, in part because they have sort of much closer relationship between government and universities. So it's not uncommon that the Chinese delegation have some researchers there, for instance. But in the delegation, you're not finding a lot of either industry people or environmental NGO people. All of that lobbying tends to take place before they go to the meetings. As you said, the US EPA have regular calls with NGO and industry people. Outside these regular calls, is it easier for industry people to sometimes get to talk to the people in government and environmental NGOs? Probably. So there's a lot of things that what is happening at these meetings is only a small part of the story, right? A big part of it was what happens before they show up, and then in many cases, some interests have a much greater voice than others.
I think it's highly variable on obviously where you are in the world and at what scale you're talking about. But in the context of energy, which is the field I'm aware of, in the U.S., if you look at the 25 largest corporations in the world, 20 of them they sell carbon. And so in the U.S., they've had enormous influence at the federal and many state levels over energy policy. policy during the Bush administration. They had, in this quadrennial review that Peter Fox-Penner mentioned that came under the Bush administration, Cheney, former CEO of Halliburton, an energy services, oil field services corporation, convened a series of meetings, and, it was a who's who of the oil and gas industry. And so we came up with an energy policy that was completely at odds of what the science tells us, should have been happening from a sustainability perspective. So, in the U.S., at least at the federal level, a lot of it is the political power. And what we've seen, so the same forces that have driven the polarization of American politics, the gerrymandering of political districts, so all that matters is winning your primary, which forces you to the left or the right extreme of your party, and the use of the social media where everyone can find a TV or newspaper outlet which reinforces their preconceived view of the world. And the takeover of politics by money has just completely, in the energy world, has again kind of polarized those competing views. And again, I think it really, in the U.S., is happening from the bottom up, a lot of it. California leads the way in a lot of stuff, and the mayor's initiatives on climate change and so on. And I really think in the long run, that's what's going to drive eventually what happens at the national level.
I think it definitely depends on what kind of table you're talking about, but I think it is easy to generalize across many tables and to say that from a demographic perspective, regardless of sort of what type of organizational representation you have, from a demographic perspective, most of the people at the table are white, upper income males. And so what's missing from the table are female voices, though that's changing. What's missing from the table are voices of people of colors other than the color white. What's missing are low-income voices, and there's a strong growth of the environmental justice movement that's been trying to change this. But importantly, also missing from the table are indigenous voices, which have concerns that are separate from the environmental justice movement.
Great. Thank you. Connor, are you ready? Other questions? No.
Yeah, so at the panel on urban mobility that you guys hosted for Earth Week, they had the mayor of Albuquerque there, I believe, and he was talking about how they implemented red light cameras and everybody hated them and he was booted out of office. So I was thinking about your example of the Danish wind and how people were willing to pay more for that. So I guess my question is, how do you sort of get that groundswell of support so that if a politician wants to enact something like this, wind initiative, they're not booted out?
Good luck. So in Denmark, I have a lot of friends in Sweden, deep roots in Sweden, and I love. It's one of my favorite places.
There's a big butt coming here now.
Yeah. So Carl Folke, I had this conversation with him, and the Swedes, they have 95% recycling of waste, and all these amazing leading the way with renewable energy and so on. Although they do have a lot of nuclear energy, but I always tell him, I said, Carl, everyone in Sweden looks the same, talks the same, and thinks the same. And of course, it's a huge exaggeration, but it's a compared. Look at the United States. It's such a Denmark is to some extent the same way, very homogeneous, smaller culture, and so they have part of that is it's easier to come to a shared vision. And Denmark has largely a shared vision, which they've bought into, which has empowered the government to do the things that it wants to do, and local communities. In the U.S., it's a different. You're in a different place. Big time, as you know, and you can see that in the current election cycle, and it's just much, much harder to do that. And that's why, again, from an energy and environmental perspective, the bubbling up from below, I think, is what's going to ultimately drive it.
And I would say this on Denmark too. Wind is one of the very few indigenous energy sources that they actually have, right? So this is about producing energy domestically that is clean and sustainable, but it also means, not having to import coal or gas or oil or any of them. And then it also helps that it's one of the richest countries in the world. I mean, there's money floating around. So yeah, people are willing to pay more, but these are people that are generally pretty darn well off.
But we could do it all internally too. There's no reason, we could do everything domestically. If we cranked up wind and solar, we wouldn't have to buy a drop of oil from anywhere else, or import energy, or buy electricity from Canada for that matter.
Now, being small and homogeneous helps.
Yeah.
Folks might be interested, the C40 and the Compact of Mayors today, I think today released a report looking at the 6 biggest barriers that cities are actually facing at the municipal level when they're trying to enact climate change initiatives. And a lot of it relates to the inability to develop a shared vision with other levels of government, but also the difficulty in enlisting the private sector as a chief actor and a sort of a chief player to get at the table. And money. Money's the other one. But folks should look at that. That was just out today. I know Les had a question.
Is there still time?
I think we've got, Connor, a couple more minutes.
I'll talk real fast.
2 more minutes? Okay.
I actually am involved in a process, have been for several years, with the Northeast Regional Ocean Council, where there is a body called the Regional Planning Board. It's supposed to resolve conflicts in ocean use, and there is a representative of the tribes, and there's a mix of men and women, and there's almost a spectrum of colors at the table. And the interesting thing that's happened now that a first plan for the Northeast Ocean is due is that in order to hold the alliance together, I was opposed to this, but the body was steered clear of any controversial issue. And when it came time to discuss trade-offs, I was actually asked to show up and explain what a trade-off is. I was shouted down and warned by the leaders of the Regional Ocean Council that if we were to pursue that avenue any further, the coalition would dissolve. And that I should be happy that there is a coalition. That is the success. So how do we balance the interpersonal dynamics and the social dynamics of creating a multilateral alliance with the deeply painful process of making hard decisions?
I think we're out of time.
Yeah?
I think that's a huge challenge, and I started by talking about how in my class I talk about both the benefits that come from a vague definition, but also the harm that's served by a vague definition. And I think what you're highlighting is exactly that, where when you invite everyone to the table in order to get them to agree, you're sacrificing something somewhere. If you exclude someone, it is certainly easier to enact policy if you are a dictator than it is to enact policy if you need consensus. And there are choices about what society wants to value at what point. And I think that there are times when having a consensus-based process isn't always the right answer. But we need to recognize that somebody's making that choice about who gets to decide when that consensus is appropriate and when not. And we're privileging those people that are getting to make that decision.
I want to end on that note, and that sounds like a conversation that warrants a deeper discussion that we can get to in a minute. I just want to thank the panelists, and I also want to say, for those folks who don't know, the Initiative on Cities was co-founded by the late former mayor Boston Tom Menino, who was mayor for 20 years, and he came to BU because he believed in the people, and he believed in the skills and talents of the people here and their ability to help people out there in cities, certainly in the U.S., but around the world. And so I want to thank these terrific people for discussing the human dimensions of sustainability, and thank you to Tony and to Lucy.